Hello and welcome to ELA class. Today we are talking about clauses. And this will just be a short introduction to what a clause is and the two main types of clauses that you find in sentences. First, the definition of a clause. A clause is a group of words that has both a subject and a predicate. So a subject is a noun, and specifically it is the noun that the sentence, or in this case the clause, is about, so the main noun, and the predicate can be a verb or can be linked to the verb as a verb phrase. So what I mean by a verb phrase is if I said is yellow, so if I said the orange is yellow, which is an odd sentence to say. But if I say the orange is yellow, the orange is the subject. It's the noun that the clause is about. And is yellow is the predicate. Is the verb, yellow describes the verb that I'm talking about, or describes the orange. So is yellow would be the predicate of that sentence. There are two types of clauses, the independent clause and the dependent clause. And we're going to see what those are right now. The independent clause. This is a type of clause. Remember, both of these will have subjects and predicates, but the independent clause is a main thought that can stand alone and it makes sense by itself. And basically, it can be a sentence all by itself. So an example of this would be the girl put on a crown. So the subject here is the girl, and the predicate is put on, or put on a crown. And we could see how that links to the rest of the sentence that it comes from. The girl put on a crown because she wanted to look like a princess. So the girl put on a crown, like I said, it can stand alone. It could be a sentence all by itself and still make sense. But if I was to take out because she wanted to look like a princess, that doesn't make sense on its own, and it couldn't be a sentence all by itself. It has to be linked to the independent clause. So the girl put on a crown is an independent clause, as it makes sense on its own. And we can think of independent clauses as parts of sentences, again, that stand alone on their own. Remember the word independent, meaning on its own. Now the opposite of that would be a dependent clause, also sometimes called a subordinate clause. Dependent clauses depend on another part of the sentence. So because of that, it is linked to and adds meaning to the independent clause and does the work of an adverb, adjective, or a noun. So it's adding meaning or substance to the independent clause, so the part of the sentence that could stand on its own. So in the sentence we looked at before, the girl put on a crown, that was the independent clause. It's the part that could be a sentence all by itself. The part that is linked to it is because she wanted to look like a princess. So that adds more meaning. It adds more color to the sentence, but it couldn't be a sentence by itself. You couldn't just say because she wanted to look like a princess and have it stand by itself or have it be its own sentence, because it wouldn't make sense on its own. So it is dependent on the independent clause. Here's a couple other examples where we could see it. Two sentences both have an independent and a dependent clause. So the independent clause in the first one is I first met her in Paris. The dependent clause is where I lived as a child. So the full sentence, I first met her in Paris where I lived as a child, has both the independent clause, I first met her in Paris, which could be a sentence all by itself, and the dependent clause, where I lived as a child, which cannot be a sentence by itself because it wouldn't make sense to just say where I lived as a child. The second sentence, Mom is taking me to buy shoes after she finishes work. Mom is a British term that means mom, so I think this comes from a British person who wrote this sentence. It says, Mom is taking me to buy shoes after she finishes work. So Mom is taking me to buy shoes. That would be a independent clause because it could be a sentence all by itself. And after she finishes work would be the dependent clause because it has to be linked to the independent clause of Mom is taking me to buy shoes. All right. So that was just a brief introduction to clauses and what they are and the two types, independent and dependent. Actually, before I see you next time, let's go back and look at the definition again. A clause is a group of words that has both a subject and a predicate. And now I will see you next time. Take care.